Last week we talked about habitat loss, degradation, and fragmentation, and we said that these processes reduce the carrying capacity of a habitat or its capacity to support biodiversity. We gave a couple examples, such as a 100-acre forest that was divided into two 45-acre forests by the construction of a road. We said that this would be detrimental to the ecosystem because they would isolate breeding populations of species and prevent them from getting access to resources such as water or food sources. We defined habitat loss as the complete loss of a habitat, habitat degradation as the reduction in the quality and carrying capacity of a habitat, but not necessarily its size, and habitat fragmentation as the breaking up of a habitat into individual isolated fragments, as in this example. We also talked about corridors, or connections between habitat fragments that allow wildlife to move back and forth between those fragments. While a fragmented habitat will still have reduced biodiversity even with corridors, a corridor will help to lessen the losses of biodiversity in that fragmented ecosystem. We also discussed the island biogeography model, which stipulates that habitats that are larger, more connected, and closer to each other tend to have higher biodiversity than habitats that are small, isolated, and disconnected. We also discussed habitat edge versus interior. We said that habitat edge is simply the outside of a habitat that's more susceptible to disturbances. As a result, habitat edge tends to have lower biodiversity. Habitat interior is the centermost or innermost portion of a habitat and tends to have the highest levels of biodiversity. Lastly, we talked about the role of the National Park Service and private landowners in protecting habitat. Only 4% of the United States is actually controlled by the National Park Service, and most habitat is found on private lands. So opportunities such as corridors are as relevant to private landowners as they are to the federal government. There are opportunities for compensation for private landowners, one key example being the Conservation Reserve Program. This is an opportunity for private farmers to convert some of their land back into habitat and receive rental payments from the federal government on an annual basis for this action. This week we're going to move on to the second major cause of extinction, invasive species. Invasive species are those that reproduce and spread rapidly and as a result harm ecosystem function, reduce ecosystem services, and reduce the carrying capacity of a habitat. Usually invasive species are introduced from other locations and as a result they lack a predator. Without this predator to keep their populations in check, they can continue to reproduce, outcompeting other species that are found within their niche. One topic we'll be talking about this week to help explain how invasive species outcompete native species is called the competition exclusion principle. What this principle stipulates is that if two species share a niche in the same location, one species will outcompete the other species, one species will survive and reproduce, the other species will be driven out of that habitat, out of that niche, or into extinction. On day one, you'll be doing two data dives relating to the competition exclusion principle. These data dives will provide you with raw data from actual experiments that were conducted previously that help scientists to gain an understanding of how this principle exists and how it affects native species when an invasive species is introduced. Your agenda for this week is similar to previous weeks. As I mentioned, on day one, you'll have a data dive. Day two is core ideas. On day three, you'll have an investigation involving an invasive species prevalence assessment, in which you'll look to see if there are invasive species found in local habitats. On day four, you'll have your review and assessment. And on day five, if there's time, you'll be doing career and community connections.